listening to another episode of Smash the Bug podcast. I'm your host, Joseph Maxwell, and I'm super excited to bring to you some really powerful content from great developers in our industry. Today is no exception as we're going to talk to Jisse Reitsma from Yerio. He is done tremendous amounts of Magento training over the years and is probably one of the most knowledgeable people on the Magento platform, and he's also kind of branching out from there into shopware. But he's one of the most knowledgeable persons as a whole to the Magento application. And I'm looking forward to hearing his thoughts regarding a recent conversation that he and I had about product repositories. And before we talk about product repositories, I'll give you a brief overview. Actually, I will let him give you a brief overview, again, since he really is a true master of Magento. And of course, he has earned that title, I believe, 3 years in a row as a result of his community contributions. Before we get into this interview, and I'm really excited about it, make sure that you have subscribed to the Smash the Bug podcast. We are on YouTube on the Swift Otter channel where we bring you great content about certifications, debugging, and just e-commerce development in general, as well as we are also found under the Smash the Bug title on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. In other words, if you're looking for the podcast, you'll find it. Just make sure you subscribe to it in the process. But without further ado, let's bring on Jisse and let's talk about product repository. So I guess, but before we do that though, I think maybe you want to introduce yourself, say what you do. Hopefully I gave you a decent introduction, but maybe there's a 30-second plug that you want to give for your services and what you do.
Well, you first of all made me really humble by saying that my knowledge is vast and I'm a big name. I don't feel that way. I basically feel just like a simple Dutch boy. That's often how I introduce myself. Okay. But yeah, I've been in the Magento community for some time. I've been doing a lot of extension development, working together with XDN or EXTDN, trying to promote better practices.
Thank you.
And I've been diving into the front end lately as well with Reacticon, for instance, and that's nice. Maybe the shameless plug. Okay. Reacticon is popping up in October. So we're actually going to talk about a lot of front-ending stuff. Hyva is going to be part of it. Shopware PWA is actually also going to be part of that story. View Storefront, nice. Of course, Magento PWA Studio. But so Reacticon is going to be interesting if you're interested in front-ending.
Excellent.
So yeah.
Well, that's really good. I'm glad to hear that. And again, thank you for coming on. So I'll give you a brief overview of what sparked this conversation. And I think we're a couple weeks now I put out a post on my social channels, and it was something along the lines of never use a product repository. And there was an asterisk on there, and and I had two caveats to that statement. And you jumped on there. You had a couple of thoughts, which was really great. It was a really powerful conversation. I love those type of debates. I learn a lot, and you brought up definitely some good comments, some good feedback on that. So then I thought, well, hey, let's just get you on this podcast. We can hash it out here, of course, nice gentlemanly fashion. But at the same time, I thought, well, there's going to be other things that we can talk about too, not just product repositories, even and the
definitely
big conversation there. So all that to say, I'm glad you're here and looking forward to this conversation. So, but before we actually hash out whether to use a product repository or not to use a product repository, maybe you can fill me and the listeners in on what is a product repository. Yeah.
So before I do that, I first wanted to also shout out that actually the thing that sparked this discussion is indeed like your LinkedIn post, and I actually love the way that you first of all just bring the word on Magento development in general, but also the way that you phrased that little thing, because it was kind of like intending to be sparking something, right?
Of course.
So here we are discussing basically one of those things that basically where opinions are differing.
Yeah.
the story starts with that I assume that you know a little bit about coding with Magento. Let's say you want to interact with your own database table. For that, you need a model, a resource model, and a collection. But instead of actually using those classes, what you could also do is create your own repository. And that repository makes it simpler. People can see my hands with little quotes in there.
Yes.
As in that the question is whether repositories are making life simpler. And well, your point was basically that a repository is maybe shoved forwards by Magento by announcing, like, do not depend upon models and resource models and collections, but do depend upon the repository because of reasons that we need to discuss. But your point was basically that one of the caveats is actually the performance,
which is purely awful. With loading products through the product repository. And I think the big case is, okay, well, let me put it back up. One of the nice things about the product repository, a couple nice things. We should put the positives out first, right? So the product repository is used in most module vendors. If they're going to build a module that modifies how the information coming out of the product being loaded, then they would naturally hook into the product repository. Get by ID or get list method. In the same way, if they're going to save it, they would hook into the save method, create a plugin or some type of modification for that. So it's centralized. It's nice. This using the web API. If you're getting something through that, it also those same methods apply to that. So it's really nice and usable across the system. And it's easy, right? You just load in the product repository and you call get list, get by ID, as there's get by, or maybe get method, I can't remember, save, delete. All those methods are there, very easy to access. So in every way, let's use a product repository.
Well, except for that, you're pointing out that actually the performance is pretty bad.
Yes.
So we started to talk about performance earlier as well, as in, if a product repository, for instance, is delivering a bad performance, then naturally it's not really about the PHP code necessarily. It could be, but I think it's also related to other things like the database. And then, I'm not sure if we know about Łukasz from Poland, but he's posting now and then on Twitter funny comments upon the Magento core. Yes. And he was posting basically one of those comments that he was loading or was trying to save products to the database, and for every product, about 100 queries were performed.
Yep, I buy that.
And then leading into the bad performance of a repository, that there's too many things going on. And because of all of those things, the database is being accessed, and therefore, the performance goes down. Right. But what if the problem is not related to that code or the product repository itself, but basically to the database performance? Question mark. So theoretically, you could say that Magento is simply just a performance hog, and that to properly run Magento, you need to have a database with zillions of gigabytes of RAM.
Right.
And then you also need to go into the tuning bit as well.
Yeah. And for some merchants, that's a reasonable solution, right? I mean, if you're running millions, significant numbers of millions through there, whether dollars or euros, that would definitely make sense. And you probably won't even just it'll be load balanced in some way at that point, and you might even have multiple database servers with, it's going to be it's going to be a significant setup that would be justified at that point. But the problem is less than that.
Yeah, exactly. And then also the calculation game needs to come in as well, right? So if you're hosting a shop and that shop is not frequently visited, but it's just a medium level shop, and you're doing fine with the commercial side. Say that you then have 10,000 products in there, so that's also not that many. And then if that means basically that you need to spend about $1,000 or euros or whatever per month on the hosting costs, then it's a little bit silly. Yes. And then comparing that maybe to other systems out there, then Magento is not doing a great job regarding those performance and the hosting requirements. And is that the fault of the hosting, or is that actually the fault of that thing called the repository? So I'm often saying, like, okay, performance issues, spend a little bit more money, then you don't need to hire a developer to tune the performance, but instead just hire or buy more memory into the server, and then you're getting the performance up. But yeah, you can only crank up the MySQL performance so far,
and that's the issue.
So instead, people are starting to tune other things, Elasticsearch and Varnish and everything else. But yeah, one of the comments out there still remains, like, well, if the product repository is not good enough in performance, what if you replace it with simply just interacting with the product collection? And that's right. Your main point. But yeah, so besides that easy goal of the repository, there's a couple of other things in there as well. The repository actually has an interface. The interface has been promoted by Magento as being a service contract. And that service contract is kind of like promising that if we, with our code, depend upon the product repository interface, then actually our code is not going to break. Right. But then Magento theoretically then is able to.
We should get out the air quotes again for that. We should get the air quotes out again for that one.
Yeah. So the story I've been telling a lot of people for so long, and as in I believe that 5.5 years ago Magento 2.0 came out. So 5.5 years ago, or a little bit less, I started to give the first development training on Magento. Or Magento 2. Started to promote also this product repository, and I've been pushing that word ever since. Like, do not depend upon the collection, because it could be that Magento is going to refactor the database, and that database is actually tightly connected to the collection.
That's right.
And then your code is going to break.
That's right. Yep.
So instead, depend upon the product repository. Well, actually, your post just made me reconsider that. As in the last 5.5 years, nothing changed in the database.
Well, that said, let me say this though: the entity manager, right? They brought that in. I don't know exactly when that came in, but that's been deprecated. Was it Magento 2.0? I don't remember. Was it later than that? You would probably remember better.
So the funny thing was actually the entity manager, it popped up somewhere in my diffs upon comparing the source code. And I believe it was actually Magento 2.1 that introduced it. In 2.2, it was actually put more into practice with the product module. And then I started to announce it again during training. And then I got ticked on my back by Magento. Like, don't promote it yet, because we're still thinking about something else. Well, I think actually that something else could be GraphQL, or it could be the command and query CQRS, so the command and query responsibility segregation. So I always need to think about all of those abbreviations. But yeah, it still leaves the question, like, there are so many promises being made on the long term, like, okay, but things are going to change in the better, but we're still stuck with that product repository. Yeah. So I kind of get you.
Yeah, but here's the thing I've thought about Jisse is a lot, is that the product repository is kind of a sugar-coated resource model and collection, right? I mean, you look at that. That's at the end of the day, that's really what it is. I'm going to have a hard time seeing, unless Magento does the unthinkable and switches to Doctrine or something like that, which I would not be opposed to that in the slightest. That would be a really cool change. You know, I can't help but wonder if it's always going to be a resource model. And considering the rate of change in 5 years, and obviously, like, a resource model is used for, just for our listeners, I'm not educating you say, the resource model is used to fetch information from the database. And the cool thing is, I use resource models all the time to create custom queries to get just one piece of information, because if you can get just one piece of information, or a column, two columns joined together, as opposed to loading in two different sets of collections and trying to merge those together, it's so much faster to let the database do it. Well, in most cases. Yeah. So that's what the resource model is. And then the collection is kind of like the resource model, but for a list. Like, you're going to load in a list of these models. And I just don't see it changing. And so I could be completely missing it on this, but we have complete control over it when we use the collection.
I think the reality was that the design, the architecture behind the repository was basically to allow third party developers like us to depend upon that repository. While in the back, actually, the database was refactored, EAV was phased out, and the whole performance was just cranked up. The reality is still that we need to do something different. However, I would be proposing also something different, a different solution than actually just bluntly adding your own collections and resource models in there. What if the community could come up with a better product repository? So what if the product repository interface is still in there, but then actually the product repository is just enhanced by a rewrite, and that rewrite could still depend upon the old code when it comes to all of the other methods within the repository, things like get by ID, delete, and save. I think there's less things wrong with that. It's mainly the get list method that is just horrible. What if somebody just could come up with a third-party replacement of that? And why not just hack in their direct MySQL queries, right? So if the database is not going to change, but the performance is going to be cranked up dramatically by that.
Yes.
Then maybe it's no longer the way that Magento has designed this thing, but sometimes maybe just following along with Magento is making things worse, while coming up with better solutions ourselves is making our lives basically better. And that's basically what open source is about as well, right?
Yes, well, it's something I'm actually working towards myself. We obviously talked about this a little while ago, and I'm having I'm gonna be. I'll come up with a better name for this, but I've been building out a list of resource models, mostly resource models that I call like lookups, and it's things to fetch information quickly. So in order to get the number of items on an order, I shouldn't need to load in an order. I can just run this quick query and it fetches it for me. But and I was thinking I would include that in this, and then I'll be making it available for everybody to use. So I guess the key point is that basically we would create our own extended our own extended product interface that would extend the Magento product interface, and it would add a parameter to the get method, or maybe we would just create a new method. I guess that's probably the safest, although everything does depend on the get one. So I guess keeping it that way. So we would add a new parameter to the get by ID method, and then it would be attributes. So you can pass in an array of attributes, which would be backwards compatible. Although, it would be backwards compatible. And so if someone wanted to load in everything, they could load in everything. But at the end of the day, we can pass a list of attributes in, and the product will be loaded up with those attributes.
Yeah, and I think actually that your idea is basically proving that there's something that I've been shouting out on multiple different levels all of my Magento life. It's open source, right? So it's not that Magento is requiring us to use it in a certain way. We have an open source license, as in we can just bluntly copy it and use it as well. Redistributing it is a different thing, but as soon as we just stick to the open source license, we can turn it inside out and do it better. And I think actually for this part with the product repository, I've been also always saying, like, just create your own improved Swift Otter product repository, and then just add all of those methods that you find handy on top of it. So personally, I've always found it a real stupid idea that all of the time that you actually want to get all of the products, that you actually need to get your hands upon the product repository. Then on top of it, a search criteria criteria builder, and then theoretically even a search criteria builder factory just to make things cleaner. And all of that trouble could be just put into practice actually in your own new class, so that class becomes the reusable thing, and it's still there. Fully with the service contract of the product repository interface as well. So, yeah, open source to the work, basically.
Now, if we're really talking about stuff, Laravel collections, I don't know if you've looked into those. Now we're talking. Like, I have so wished Magento would do that. And I don't know what it is from a performance perspective. I can't imagine it being bad. But I mean, there's literally a list of 50 methods that come in with that Laravel collections. And that's powerful. You talk about the amount of boilerplate code that we write. Now I'm kind of talking myself up a level here. Like, what would it take to actually turn product repository into an actual Laravel collection? That would be mind blowing as far as what we could do then.
So personally, I'm saying like go ahead and do that. But I think actually a lot of times actually in the community people are lacking that feeling. That people are looking in the direction of Magento to come up with the solution. And then actually if Magento is not coming up with a solution, they complain about Magento. They start bashing at it, saying that the performance is lacking and etc. While we're still all making money out of it as well. And personally, I came up with a listing basically of a couple of other things that are kind of like something that makes me wonder whether Magento is doing it in the right way. So why not come up with a better alternative? So for instance, I've been blogging about something on the front end, JavaScript based. Magento is based upon require. Require is being initialized through datamage init and xmagento init. But actually, if you load things through a manual require inline, then you're skipping actually that whole bootstrap of loading datamage init and xmagento init, speeding up things.
Oh, that'd be nice.
EAV attributes versus extension attributes. So from the point of view of extensibility, I'm supposed to say extension attributes are the way to go forth. However, EAV attributes are often faster because they already integrate with that complex querying mechanism. So theoretically, EAV attributes are better for your code. And it's kind of like swearing. I'm not sure if that's an English expression, but swearing inside of the church. It's definitely a Dutch expression. Okay, saying it like, where I'm promoting maybe a couple of things, and that's basically what you're also saying. We're promoting a couple of things that we're not supposed to be promoting out of that story that we've been living with for so long, that Magento is proposing it in a certain way. But what if we can do it different?
Now, I gotta stop you on one thing though. Yeah. You say you prefer EAV attributes over extension attributes. That's funny because I'm completely the opposite. Like to an extent, like if something pertains to a product that needs to be edited, extension or EAV, right? 100%. Yeah. But if it's some type of ancillary information that the admin never needs to see, and it's something that I'm adding, I'm controlling, I love extension attributes, particularly because of how they relate to... Oh, okay. Well, then we're on the same page.
No, but me too.
Okay,
but,
okay, good.
What I'm more saying is actually that often actually, if you talk to developers and you ask them like, which one should you use, extension attributes or EAV attributes, the answer is often very quickly, oh, but you need to have extension attributes. While there's actually a story for EAV attributes. Oh,
absolutely.
As well. Yeah. I think that's kind of like the out of the box thinking that I would like to promote. That let's not just look at the technology as being offered, but let's look at it from an open source point of view. Let's say that we can improve it by coming up with something better. And I think that's also kind of like the state of the whole ecosystem that we're currently in. So you've been talking about Hyva, for instance. So what is Hyva? Well, it's basically just throwing out the thing that is lacking in Magento and replacing it with something better. Yes. So what if we can do that same thing with extension attributes? What if we can do the same thing with the product repository and things like that? That's kind of like my thinking along, like thinking outside of the box. And it's basically because we are developers, we can improve it. And because it's open source, it's allowed to be improving it. So yeah, let's just do that.
This is such a wonderful message. I totally agree, because it's one thing to complain. We can whine, groan, moan. We can whatever you want to put in there. Like we can do it all. But at the end of the day, Magento is open source. Shopware is open source. I generally hear less complaints about Shopware, but they're open source, so we can do something about it. And if nothing else, well, the other one of the biggest things, and I'm just going to throw this out there, that I have observed personally, and I hate to say it, but I kind of have extrapolated to others, and when I hear these complaints, is that I remember back in the day when I was getting up on knockout and UI components and all that kind of stuff. I complained a lot about it, not too much publicly, but to any offline conversation, it was probably going to start talking about how awful UI components were. And then I started digging into them. I started learning about them, and I think it was about that time I took the front-end developer certification. I wrote the study guide for it, and it started clicking for me. It was like, okay, yeah, I don't think this is built right. There's a lot of stuff I don't agree with, but I get it, and I get how it works. I can work with it, and I feel like at the end of the day, I'm winning the fight against this, as opposed to it just completely destroying me for days on end. And I wonder if the reason for a lot of complaints, not all, but a lot of complaints, is that the person who's complaining has not actually taken the time to dig in. You know, again, like that recent study that I did, 70% of developers in India don't use Xdebug. I think it was a little bit better in US and Europe. I think that was about 30 and 40%, something like that. 30%, just to be conservative there, don't use Xdebug. And that's a big deal. Like, that's a really big deal. Xdebug is it's like the opening the magic box. Like, that is what allows you to get in to understand this. And you still might not agree with it at the end of the day, and probably a lot of people wouldn't. That's fine. But at least you're going to understand how it works. You're going to understand what's going on, what goes into this, and I think it's going to make it'll totally change the dynamics, at least for me. It takes it from complaining status to maybe critique status.
Yeah, and personally, so I try to see the learning process as it is, also kind of like as a separate thing, apart from like teaching people how to deal with Magento in the first place.
Yes.
And actually, the word that I always try to focus upon there is a learning curve. A learning curve is basically that, first of all, if you don't know about something, then it first needs to go up. Yes. And that means uphill, it's difficult. You don't see the top. You don't know like what else is coming. And with every corner that you make, there's yet another steep climb up there. But that's the whole point of a curve. But also we need to realize that curve is flattening after some time. That's with other systems, it's maybe like climbing a hill. With Magento, it's climbing the Everest. But that's not the point. It's still a curve. And the negative attitude that we often have is not necessarily due to the technology, but it's due to the learning curve itself.
That's right. Yeah. Instead of complaining at the beginning, we should ask questions at the beginning, and then if there is complaints that are still present, once we flatten it out, we feel like we really understand this. Maybe that's the time to start voicing complaints. But like you were saying, voice them in the way of making changes as opposed to just pitching rocks at a terrible platform, which by the way is free. And Magento is open source. Obviously, there's Adobe Commerce, which is expensive, but Magento is free. So it's open source again.
Yeah. Still, we have to say that product repositories, their performance is sucking. So there is room for complaining.
Oh yeah, for sure.
But instead of actually just sitting down and not doing anything about it, actually the most beautiful thing that you can do is just to step in and try to improve it. And I think actually if everyone is realizing that we don't need to wait any longer for Magento to fix that database performance of product repositories. Let's not wait for that anymore. Let's just see this as a fact that maybe in 5 years' time, the product repositories are still going to be slow. And then actually the honest question would be, how are we going to improve it? And that's basically by joining your initiative. So trying to improve it gradually and just cranking up the performance with open source. Yeah,
I agree. I totally agree. This has been good, Jisse. I appreciate you coming on and chatting and going back and forth a little bit. But it sounds like we go back and forth a little bit, but it sounds like we kind of end up the same place at the end of the day. So that's reassuring to me. But I've missed these conversations very much because just not going to conferences for the past year. It's like 2020 was a year that literally was vanished from my life. I mean, so it's good. I'm looking forward to seeing you in person, to continuing these conversations, and I really appreciate you coming on here today to share your learnings, your wisdom, and this has been really good.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was awesome, and let's keep on the discussion going offline or online or wherever.
Well, I might have another controversial one coming your way, so you'll have to let me know on that one.
I'm your man.
Yeah.
Cool.
Anyways, this is good. Thank you for coming on, Jisse. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Wow, that was a really cool conversation. I love interviewing people with these podcasts, but this is definitely topping the charts for me, and how the good conversation going back and forth, and I hope it was enlightening for you, because this comes from my learning. I'm writing code literally every day. Jisse's training, he's talking with people. I'm sure he's writing code every day or almost every day. This comes out of real life learning, real life experiences, conversations. And if you've never had a thought about using a product repository, well, maybe you will have a second thought about that, and maybe you'll think of another approach, and looking forward to our solution coming out for that. But also, another takeaway from this is any code that you're writing, give it a double take. Why am I writing this? Is it just because I've been told to write it? Is it the best practice? If so, okay, why is it the best practice? Be willing to question yourself, question what you are writing, what you are doing. And I think that is also another marker of a great developer. You understand why you are doing this and what are the implications of doing it this way. Then you can make an honest, informed decision as far as the best approach doing the work that you are doing. So it's been an absolute pleasure having you here. Hope that you have taken value from this. And again, make sure you subscribe to this podcast so that you don't miss any further upcoming episodes of hopefully what I hope to be this really good quality, informative content.